You're in a restricted airport area.
This is my property. You're trespassing.
I need ID now.
You're profiling me under the guise of security.
Hands visible. Don't move.
I'm Federal Judge Marcus Holloway. You're out of line.
The voice cut through the terminal with sharp authority. Stop. You're in a restricted airport area. The words were loud enough to turn heads. Conversations nearby slowed. Footsteps hesitated. For a split second, the quiet rhythm of early morning travel broke apart. The man who'd been stopped didn't flinch. "This is my property," he said calmly, one hand resting on his briefcase. "You're trespassing." That response alone caught the officers off guard. Most people froze. Most people apologized. Most people obeyed without question. "I need ID. Now," the officer snapped, stepping closer. The man raised his head slowly, eyes steady, voice controlled. "You're profiling me under the guise of security." That's when the tone changed. "Hands visible. Don't move." A pause hung in the air. Heavy, uncomfortable, charged. The man exhaled once, then spoke words that would soon echo far beyond that airport terminal. "I'm Federal Judge Marcus Holloway. You're out of line." But at that moment, none of it mattered. Minutes earlier, Judge Marcus Holloway had been just another traveler navigating an airport he knew well. 52 years old, impeccably dressed in a Navy suit, leather briefcase in hand, he moved with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to command, but never demanding it. He had spent over 15 years on the federal bench. Lawyers respected him. Prosecutors measured their words around him. Defendants understood that appearing in his courtroom meant accountability was coming. Fair, firm, and unavoidable. That morning, Judge Holloway was traveling to a judicial conference in another state. He arrived early, as he always did. The terminal was calm. A few business travelers. A handful of early commuters. Nothing out of the ordinary. Security was routine. Shoes off. Briefcase placed carefully in the bin. Metal detector crossed without incident. No alarm. No alert. No issue. Judge Holloway waited on the other side, retrieving his belongings with practiced ease. That's when Officer Danny Rodriguez noticed him. Not because of suspicious behavior. Not because of prohibited items, but because of something else entirely. Rodriguez had worked airport security for 8 years. He believed he was thorough. He believed he was experienced. What he lacked was awareness, the kind that distinguishes vigilance from bias. He didn't see the tailored suit, the professional posture, or the briefcase that cost more than his monthly paycheck. He saw a well-dressed black man traveling alone. Rodriguez glanced toward his supervisor, Janet Pierce. A decade of shared experience passed between them in a single look. No words were exchanged. None were needed. They had done this before. Judge Holloway slipped his shoes back on, unaware that a decision had already been made about him. "Sir," Rodriguez said, stepping into his path, "I'm going to need you to step aside for additional screening." Holloway paused. He looked up, composed but curious. "Is there an issue with my luggage?" he asked. "Did something trigger the detector?" Rodriguez didn't answer. He simply repeated the instruction. That was the moment everything changed. Because Judge Marcus Holloway didn't lower his head. He didn't comply blindly. He asked questions. And those questions would expose a system that had gone unchecked for years. Judge Marcus Holloway didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He didn't posture. He simply stood still and asked a question that Officer Rodriguez clearly wasn't expecting. "On what grounds?" Rodriguez blinked. "It's a random check. You need to cooperate." Holloway tilted his head slightly. "Then state the policy you're following." On camera. That single sentence shifted the balance of power. Rodriguez hesitated. He wasn't trained for this. Most people didn't ask for explanations. They didn't understand procedure. They didn't challenge authority with calm precision. Judge Holloway did. There was no alert. Holloway continued. "The detector didn't signal. My bag wasn't flagged. Explain the cause." Rodriguez's jaw tightened. He glanced back towards Supervisor Janet Pierce, who had been watching closely from only a few feet away. She stepped forward, her expression firm, rehearsed, and dismissive. "Sir," Pierce said, "your selection was random. You're delaying security operations." Holloway looked past her, scanning the checkpoint. 6 passengers, white passengers, had passed through the same detector moments before him. None had been stopped. None had been questioned. "Random," Holloway repeated. "Interesting." Pierce crossed her arms. "Questioning security procedures is suspicious behavior. That was when Holloway felt it. The same sensation he'd felt countless times in his courtroom when testimony didn't add up. The tightening behind the eyes. The instinct that told him the truth was being bent. He remained calm. "May I have your name and badge number?" he asked. Pierce's lips pressed into a thin line, but she complied. Reluctantly. "And is this area under video surveillance?" Holloway added. "Yes," Pierce said, then seemed to regret it instantly. Rodriguez returned holding a handheld metal detection wand. "Spread your arms and legs." Holloway complied without resistance. But as he did, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He began recording. Pierce reacted immediately. "Put that away. Recording security procedures is prohibited." Holloway didn't stop filming. "I'm in a public space," he said evenly. "I'm recording my interaction with public officials." The dynamic shifted instantly. Rodriguez completed the pat-down. Nothing. No alarms. No contraband. No explanation. Still, Pierce wasn't done. "Your briefcase will need to be searched," she said. Rodriguez opened it and began removing items one by one. Legal documents. Pens. Business cards. A laptop. A leather portfolio. Then he opened the portfolio. The color drained from his face. Inside was Judge Holloway's federal judicial identification. Rodriguez froze. His eyes widened. His confidence evaporated. He turned the portfolio toward Pierce, whispering something under his breath. Pierce's expression flickered, surprise, then panic, before hardening into defiance. Instead of stopping, she doubled down. "Credentials don't exempt anyone from screening," she said loudly, ensuring nearby travelers could hear. "We will continue." Judge Holloway closed his eyes briefly and took a breath. He could have ended it right there. He could have pulled rank. He could have demanded escalation. He chose not to. Instead, he let them continue. Because he wasn't just experiencing harassment anymore. He was witnessing a pattern he suspected had already harmed countless others who didn't have his authority, his knowledge, or his ability to fight back. And he was going to document every second of it. Pierce motioned for Rodriguez to continue. "Be thorough," she said. Rodriguez swallowed and obeyed. He removed every remaining item from Judge Holloway's briefcase, laying them out with exaggerated care. Papers were unfolded. Folders opened. Personal and professional materials exposed to anyone close enough to watch. Judge Holloway stood silently, phone still recording, posture relaxed but eyes alert. He wasn't nervous. He was studying them the way he studied witnesses on the stand, watching tone, body language, inconsistencies. Rodriguez lifted the laptop. "This needs to be powered on," he announced. Holloway raised an eyebrow. "On what authority?" "Security protocol," Pierce snapped. Holloway unlocked the laptop and handed it over. Rodriguez began clicking through folders, court documents, case notes, confidential materials tied to active proceedings. Files that were protected by law. Files no security officer had any legal right to view. Pierce noticed too late. "Close it," she muttered. "That's enough." But the damage was done. Judge Holloway had just watched two officers access privileged judicial materials without cause, warrant, or justification. It wasn't just harassment anymore. It was a violation. The search dragged on. Minutes stretched. 15. Then 20. Other passengers began to notice. Some slowed their pace. Others stopped outright. Phones came out. Whispers spread. A well-dressed black man surrounded by officers. Hands visible. Belongings scattered. No one else at the checkpoint was being treated this way. Pierce felt the pressure building. She could see the optics collapsing around her. But instead of stopping, she pressed forward, trapped by her own decisions. Rodriguez found nothing, because there was nothing to find. Finally, Pierce handed Judge Holloway his belongings. "You're free to go." No apology. No explanation. No acknowledgement. Judge Holloway packed his briefcase carefully, methodically. His flight was boarding. He didn't rush. Instead, he stepped closer to Pierce. "I'll need your supervisor's contact information," he said. Pierce stiffened. "Why?" "I'm filing a formal complaint," Holloway replied calmly. "And I'll be requesting copies of the footage and incident reports." Her expression shifted, defensive, then uneasy. Judge Holloway smiled for the first time. It wasn't friendly. It was deliberate. He missed his flight. He didn't care. He spent the next hour making calls, rescheduling the conference, contacting a civil rights colleague, alerting judicial media relations. By the time he boarded a later flight, Everything was already in motion. His phone held 20 minutes of video. His briefcase held witness contacts from passengers who had seen everything. His mind was already building the case. And during the flight, he began researching the people who thought this would end quietly. At 30,000 feet, Judge Marcus Holloway wasn't thinking about the conference he had missed. He was thinking about patterns. He opened his laptop, connected to the plane's Wi-Fi, and began digging. Names first. Badge number second. Public records after that. Supervisor Janet Pierce. What he found made his jaw tighten. For prior complaints. All filed by Black or Hispanic travelers. All describing invasive searches. All dismissed. Every single one marked, unsubstantiated, by internal review. Not resolved. Not investigated. Dismissed. Officer Danny Rodriguez wasn't clean either. 3 similar incidents in 2 years. Same outcome. Same paperwork language. Same quiet burial inside the system. It wasn't random. It was routine. By the time the plane landed, Judge Holloway had mapped it out clearly. This wasn't about one bad morning or overzealous officers. It was a system designed to protect misconduct and punish anyone who dared challenge it. He made his next call from the terminal. His wife listened silently as he explained everything. She wasn't shocked. As a successful Black attorney, she had lived her own version of this story more times than she could count. But she heard something else in his voice. Focus. Resolve. The tone he used when a verdict was already decided. That evening, instead of preparing for his presentation, Judge Holloway built a timeline. Every word spoken, every command given, every violation tied to statute and policy. He cross-referenced TSA guidelines, federal civil rights law, Fourth Amendment precedent. He wasn't venting. He was prosecuting. The next morning, he called the U.S. Attorney's office in the district where the airport was located. The prosecutor on the line initially sounded polite, but unconvinced. Airport complaints rarely became federal cases. That changed when Holloway explained the unauthorized access to confidential judicial materials, the pattern of racial targeting, and the recorded evidence. The line went quiet. Then the tone shifted. Within hours, federal agents requested footage from the checkpoint. Employment records, complaint histories, internal emails. Pierce and Rodriguez reported for work the next day, completely unaware that their routine stop had detonated a chain reaction. They had no idea a federal judge had handed the system enough evidence to turn its spotlight inward. The FBI moved fast. Agent Sarah Chun took the lead. 15 years in civil rights investigations had trained her to spot patterns others ignored. She saw them immediately. Security footage revealed months of similar stops. Well-dressed Black and Hispanic travelers pulled aside, while white passengers walked through untouched. And then she found the administrator, Tom Bradley, the man responsible for dismissing complaints. Emails told the story. Coaching officers, minimizing reports, protecting numbers, protecting careers. Corruption wasn't hiding. It was documented. Meanwhile, Judge Holloway reached out to colleagues. The responses poured in. Judges, attorneys, executives, doctors, different airports. Same story. Additional screening. No explanation. Humiliation masked as procedure. He compiled their accounts into a report and sent it everywhere that mattered. DOJ, FAA, federal oversight bodies, and investigative journalists. The story exploded. Video footage aired nationwide. A federal judge, calm, dignified, treated like a criminal without cause. The airport authority tried to deny it. 48 hours later, they stopped. Pierce and Rodriguez were placed on leave. Statements were rewritten. Consultants were hired. But Judge Holloway wasn't interested in damage control. He wanted accountability. And he was just getting started. The airport authority thought placing Pierce and Rodriguez on administrative leave would slow things down. It did the opposite. Once the story broke, the phones didn't stop ringing. Civil rights attorneys saw the footage and immediately recognized what it represented. Not just misconduct, but proof. Journalists requested records. Advocacy groups demanded audits. Federal agencies wanted explanations. Judge Marcus Holloway partnered with civil rights attorney Michelle Roberts, someone known for taking on institutions that assumed they were untouchable. Together, they didn't just prepare a complaint. They prepared a reckoning. The federal lawsuit named names. Pierce, Rodriguez, Tom Bradley, the airport authority itself. It outlined violations with surgical precision, unlawful search and seizure, racial discrimination, abuse of authority, violation of protected legal materials, and systemic failure to address known misconduct. This wasn't emotional. It was airtight. Discovery opened the floodgates. Internal emails surfaced. Text messages followed. And that's when the narrative collapsed. Rodriguez had joked about putting people in their place. Pierce complained about fancy-dress thugs who thought money or status made them untouchable. Bradley reassured them that complaints would be handled men erased. Performance reviews praised Pierce and Rodriguez for being thorough. Bradley received bonuses for keeping complaint numbers low. The system rewarded the very behavior it publicly denied. Depositions were devastating. Judge Holloway testified with calm authority, citing policy line by line. When defense attorneys tried to argue standard procedure, he opened a binder containing the actual regulations and read aloud the sections the officers had violated. Pierce fared worse. Under oath, she admitted she'd never received bias training. She couldn't explain why minority passengers were searched at disproportionate rates. When confronted with her own messages, she had no defense. There would be no trial. The evidence was overwhelming. The airport authorities settled for $8.5 million. Pierce, Rodriguez, and Bradley were terminated immediately. An independent oversight board was mandated. Statistical monitoring became required. Bias training became non-negotiable. Judge Holloway donated his share of the settlement. This was never about money, he said. It was about stopping a pattern. The ripple effects spread nationwide. Other airports adopted reforms. Other travelers came forward. Other cases moved forward, because now there was precedent. Rodriguez never worked security again. Pierce left the field entirely. Bradley pleaded guilty to federal civil rights violations and was sentenced to prison. But the most lasting impact wasn't punishment. It was exposure. A system built to operate quietly had been dragged into the light by a man who refused to stay silent. And that light didn't turn off when the cameras left. The settlement closed the case on paper, but in reality, it opened something much larger. Across the country, transportation officials, lawmakers, and civil rights organizations studied the details of Judge Marcus Holloway's case. What they saw was impossible to ignore. This wasn't a single failure. It was a blueprint of how discrimination could hide inside policy language, paperwork, and discretion. The Department of Transportation circulated the settlement internally as a warning. Airports were instructed to audit their screening data. Patterns were no longer allowed to hide behind the word random. Numbers had to match explanations. Disparities had to be justified or corrected. At the federal level, oversight committees requested testimony. Agent Sarah Chun appeared before lawmakers and described what the footage revealed, how bias didn't always look like shouting or slurs, but like routine decisions applied selectively, day after day, until harm became normalized. Her recommendations became policy drafts. Independent complaint review boards, mandatory body camera usage in certain screening zones, automatic escalation of repeat complaints to outside investigators. Judge Holloway watched much of this quietly. He returned to his courtroom changed, not hardened, but sharpened. He understood now how often people stood before him already exhausted by systems that presumed guilt. That awareness showed up in his rulings, in how carefully he scrutinized justifications offered by authority figures, in how little patience he had for explanations that relied on convenience instead of law. Colleagues noticed. So did defendants. But the public impact mattered just as much. Travelers who had once stayed silent began documenting their experiences. Lawyers who once declined cases now accepted them. Airlines and airport authorities, fearing similar exposure, began proactive reforms rather than reactive denials. Judge Holloway received letters weekly. Doctors, students, parents, veterans, people who saw themselves in that footage. He responded to many personally, not as a judge, as a citizen who understood what it meant to be questioned not for what you carried, but for who you were. Rodriguez tried to rebuild quietly. A warehouse security job. Lower pay. No authority. He avoided attention, but his name followed him. Pierce left security altogether. Retail management. A different uniform. A smaller sphere of influence. Bradley served his sentence. None of them ever regained what they'd lost. And none of them ever expected the man they stopped that morning would become the reason their system unraveled. Judge Holloway never sought publicity, but his case became required reading in civil rights training programs nationwide. A reminder, That power misused leaves evidence. That patterns don't disappear when ignored. And that sometimes, the most dangerous thing to an unjust system is a calm man who knows the law and refuses to look away. Months passed, but the effects of Judge Marcus Holloway's case continued to ripple outward in ways no settlement agreement could contain. Airports weren't just changing policies anymore, they were changing language. The word random was no longer enough. Officers were required to articulate reasons. Supervisors were required to document decisions. Data was reviewed by independent analysts who didn't answer to airport authorities. And for the first time, patterns had consequences. Agent Sarah Chun expanded her investigation model nationwide. What began as one case became a framework. She trained new agents on how to identify discrimination disguised as discretion. Her testimony helped push forward legislation strengthening penalties for civil rights violations committed under color of authority. Law schools added the case to their curriculum. Judicial conferences discussed it openly, not as an embarrassment, but as a warning. Judge Holloway, meanwhile, never treated himself as the story's hero. In interviews, he redirected attention. "I was protected by my position," he said. "Most people aren't." That truth sat heavy. It forced institutions to confront what they had long denied. That respectability didn't shield black and brown travelers. It only delayed the moment of suspicion. In his courtroom, Holloway became known for one question. "Explain your justification." Officers who testified before him learned quickly that vague answers wouldn't survive scrutiny. Neither would assumptions dressed up as instinct. Defense attorneys noticed a shift too. He wasn't lenient, but he was precise. Every claim of authority had to stand on evidence, not comfort. Outside the courtroom, travelers still recognized him occasionally. Quiet nods. Thank yous whispered in passing. He accepted them politely, but he never lingered on the attention. The point, to him, had never been recognition. It had been disruption. Rodriguez and Pierce faded from headlines, but not from institutional memory. Their names became examples used in training sessions. What happens when power goes unchecked? When bias is rewarded? When silence is mistaken for consent? The airport authority that once denied everything now published annual transparency reports. Complaints were tracked publicly. Outcomes documented. The system hadn't become perfect, but it had become visible. And visibility changes behavior. Judge Holloway once wrote in a private note that he never expected to become a symbol. He only expected to be treated lawfully. That expectation, simple, reasonable, and too often unmet, was what fueled everything that followed. One refusal, one camera, one man who chose documentation over deference, and an entire system forced to answer questions it had avoided for decades. Years later, the footage still circulates. Not because it's sensational, but because it's familiar. A man stopped without cause. Authority asserted without explanation. Compliance demanded without justification. The setting could be any airport. The officers could be anyone empowered to decide who belongs and who doesn't. But what makes this moment different is what happened next. Judge Marcus Holloway didn't raise his voice. He didn't resist. He didn't escalate. He documented. And in doing so, he revealed something the system depended on remaining hidden. That discrimination doesn't need cruelty to function. It only needs routine. The officers who stopped him believed the moment would pass. That he'd miss a flight, feel embarrassed, maybe complain into a void. They believed the system would absorb it the way it always had. They were wrong. Because sometimes the wrong person gets stopped. Sometimes the person being profiled knows policy better than the profiler. Sometimes the person being dismissed understands how power actually works and how fragile it becomes under scrutiny. Judge Holloway returned fully to his role on the bench. He never chased reform headlines. But his case became a reference point, cited in decisions, trainings, and investigations across the country. It reminded institutions that credibility is not automatic. It must be earned. Every day, for travelers, the impact was quieter but profound. More people began asking questions. More people recorded. More people refused to be intimidated by vague commands unsupported by law. Not with anger, with clarity. Judge Holloway once said that the most dangerous myth in America is that fairness will eventually appear on its own. It doesn't, he said. It appears when someone insists on it. That morning at the airport, he insisted. Not because he was a judge, but because he was a citizen who understood his rights and refused to surrender them for the comfort of others. The officers thought they were enforcing security. Instead, they exposed insecurity within a system that mistook power for permission and silence for acceptance. This wasn't just a story about an airport stop. It was a reminder that justice doesn't always arrive wearing a robe. Sometimes it arrives holding a phone, asking calm questions, and refusing to move until the truth is on record. And once it is, nothing stays the same.